I think we're seeing more and more people joining, which is great. And I look forward to a really engaging session, and your questions will be vital, of course. I am joined by Professor Ross Coomer, a long-standing expert in the county lines field and the principal investigator on our project, and Dr. Chris Devani, who has undertaken much of the research work on the project and is also an expert in the county lines field, having worked on this project for over 2 years. And also joined by Nathan Capstick, who's our communications and engagement officer. So that's us. I just wanted to outline what we're going to be doing. So we're going to have a presentation for about 35 minutes on our research, followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers. So please, if you have a question or a comment in mind as we go through the presentation, hit that button at the bottom saying Q&A, and please leave it there. You don't need to wait to the end or anything. And then I'll pick them up at the end of the presentation, and we can discuss them. Before the start, I just wanted to say something really brief about the centre, which some of you may not know a lot about. We're now over 3 years old, with a little under 2 years left to run, funded by the SRC, and our frighteningly ambitious aim is to reshape how the police and other organisations work together in order to reduce harm among vulnerable people. And to that end, we've now funded 47 projects, not all of them research projects, but mostly research projects. And this study on county lines was one of our first. It clearly aligns with our mission in that it very much speaks to how police and other organisations currently work together around vulnerable people caught up in county lines, and begs the question of how this might be done better. So that's enough from me, and if we could get the slides up, that would be great. Good. Okay. There's the title. If we could move on to the next one. Great. I just wanted to let everybody know about our September conference. So on the 9th and 10th of September, we have our second big annual conference. We held one last year. I think it was a real success. I'm clearly biased, but it was, I think, agreed to be a real success. We're holding that in Leeds. You can scan that QR code to get more gen on that, or indeed go to our website. But I invite you to join us at that conference in Leeds. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Ross for the presentation.
Hi everybody. You can see on the first slide there that this is an introduction to our project, and specifically what you can see is a list of names. Who are those people that worked on the project, helped to design it and helped to research it. Next one please, Chris. Thank you. Okay, so most of you have come along today because you have an interest in this particular area. So I just want to give you a little bit of a background to how the research came about and what kind of ideas underpinned it. And that was fairly simple, really. Going back to around 2018, when the project itself was in its early stages of conceptualization, it was obvious to us that the police were grappling with county lines, both from an enforcement perspective, but also from a exploitation perspective. And this was on the back of the police knowing that they were also grappling with how to better understand and how to better police child sexual exploitation. So child criminal exploitation came on the coattails of that in many ways. And whilst they were in some ways earlier into the area of child criminal exploitation than they were child sexual exploitation, they were in some ways even more confused about how to perhaps police that effectively and appropriately. Now, because of this, when we started to put this project together, which was to look at exactly that, how might the police be policing child criminal exploitation, the police themselves were very keen on supporting the research. And indeed, as Charlie explained, there's a number of projects related to the centre itself that are engaging the police and engaging all those uh, agencies that you would expect to be involved in research. And this particular project was no difference at all. We got lots of support from the police in terms of the idea of carrying it out. And as we'll see in a little while, also in terms of them supporting us getting access to various parts of the system that you might not always expect to get access to. And all this happened really pretty much because the police were as concerned as we were, that they were getting off on the right foot in terms of how they might approach policing child criminal exploitation. But at no point, it's worth saying, were the police particularly involved in much by way of the design of the project, certainly not in terms of how the project itself was run. Nor indeed how how the findings have been reported, and they have very much had a hands-off aspect in that regard, and we have been very independent in terms of how we have worked with the police, but they have been, I think it's worth saying, cooperative in this sense, and that's indicative, I think, of a generally purposeful and positive sense that the police wanted to move forward. In terms of the key ideas behind the research, it was really to try to find out more about exactly how the policing of child criminal exploitation was being policed across the country, not just in individual parts of the country like the Met or indeed in Merseyside, but across the country, and for the purposes of trying to help the police as well as other organisations and agencies understand how that was taking place and what might be improved. To look at what are the key challenges in terms of improving that policing process and the processing of people in terms of either criminalisation or safeguarding, and also to look as well as we could at the kinds of barriers and facilitators between policing and the broader safeguarding partnership structures, including structures such as the MACE hubs themselves. Next slide, please, Chris. As you can see, there's a little bit of a lag, but please be patient. Now, look, I think that most people that are attending this will be familiar with roughly what we might consider county lines to be, but we also acknowledge that it is a somewhat contested and complex term, but that broadly the way that we approached it on the project is that we understood it, as do the police, as a term used to describe a certain amount of criminal activity whereby certain urban hubs that were already key importers and exporters of drugs to other cities were now doing so by sending often exploited individuals, often children, out into other areas beyond the urban hubs that they originated from, and that they were doing that in a systematic way, which was largely unseen before the last 10 to 15 years, and that these new networks were, to some degree at least, more professional and more organised than before. But that would have varied over different county lines themselves. And that these new networks established themselves from the hub in those other spaces. Sometimes those were fairly close to the original hub, and sometimes they were really quite far away. Chris, next one, please. Okay, so what was it that we did? How did we go about doing it? Well, as I said before, we were lucky enough to get good cooperation from the police. And in fact, we got the kind of cooperation from the police that the police can't even get from each other. And what that meant for us was that we managed to speak to key persons within 44 of the 45 territorial UK police forces. And those key persons would have been individuals that had a historical grounding in what their particular forces had been doing and was doing about county lines and about child criminal exploitation and adult exploitation. And the reason we did that was to get some baseline, what we've called baseline insight into what was going on in those forces, what was going on across the country, how it was going on and why it was going on in the way that it was. And the reason why we say baseline insight is because originally we thought we were going to go for baseline data, but very quickly we found out that in fact, there was very little by baseline data that was comparable across police forces and even within police forces themselves. So we defaulted back to an informed position from people within those forces that could tell us the sorts of things that we wanted to know. But I think it's worth saying that even in terms of structures within those police forces, structures that were to do with partnerships and structures to do with safeguarding, it wasn't even easy for those individuals to report back to us. But more on that later. That was phase one. And phase one did give us this baseline insight. So phase two was what we call rapid appraisals. We did 3 follow-up rapid appraisals to get more depth into the kind of insights that we thought were important that came out of phase one. And that meant going into parachuting into 3 different force areas that we thought would be helpful in that regard, to interview police officers, members of statutory services, people in NGOs, as well as people with lived experience, victimhood of county lines and other forms of exploitation, to enable us to garner greater depth on the issues that we thought had emerged from phase one that were important. And we also undertook a number of observations in those spaces of policing initiatives, operations, and different aspects of those operations doing different things. But one of the things that we also observed was, for example, ride-alongs with police conducting anti-county lines activities. We also, to, I suppose, top and tail phase one and phase two, carried out numerous interviews with key persons, both within policing and outside of policing, who were concerned with and were working on partnership activity, and as well as things like governance of structures such as MACE, so that they could inform us about how well were some of these partnerships working, how well were structures such as MACE working or not. And that helped to provide a broader framework for our study. Please, Chris. So before we give you the findings, just a little bit more contextualization regarding both CSE and CCE. So CSE being child sexual exploitation and CCE being child criminal exploitation. And it's really worth pointing out that for the project, we felt that the distinctiveness of CCE is important to distinguish between that and CSE, both for policing practice, but also for, I think, conceptual understanding of what the 2 different issues are that are going on. And this might be an area of questions and for debate once we've finished our presentation. But there are parallels, of course, clear parallels. And some of those parallels are for policing that and for safeguarding partnerships, that vulnerable children can be dismissed often as offenders or to blame or to be culpable themselves of their victimhood. And early identification, obviously, of that, and understanding the signs of grooming and exploitation for safeguarders is important to get that right for both of those groups. And those groups sometimes do, of course, overlap. For policing, but also for partnership safeguarding partnerships, there are clear resource constraints regarding how to prioritize resources in terms of dealing with both CSE and CCE, and we found in our research that resourcing was a key issue for many forces. And one of the things that is important, of course, for both of these areas is that there is an increase in victim-centered approaches and a reprioritization away, arguably, from enforcement towards safeguarding. And whilst there is not this reprioritization, the broader context remains one whereby resources are constrained and minimized unless they are reprioritized. Obviously, in both areas, victims are often silenced through fear from those that are exploiting them. A loyalty, misplaced though it may be sometimes, and importantly, a mistrust of authorities, and importantly, a mistrust of the police. And of course, if the police or other safeguarding partnerships aren't fully trained and they don't understand that people are not necessarily going to come to them and tell them that they're being exploited, that it's in fact their job to partly interpret and understand where those signals are and what are the key kind of signposts that they need to be aware of, then that can continue to mean that people that are victims are unseen as victims. And lastly, for both of those areas, it's a relative postcode lottery as to how and the degree to which people are appropriately and effectively safeguarded. And the lesson, of course, is that multi-agency collaboration that is consistent and effective across postcodes, regardless of resourcing and regardless of training levels, it's important to get that right. Chris, please. However, there are some key differences that we want to point out. This is still by way of context. And this is why, for us, it's important that child criminal exploitation isn't just lumped in with child sexual exploitation, or indeed not just lumped in with vulnerability. Increasingly, it's arguably easier for the police, it's easier for the general public, and it's easier for safeguarding agencies to recognise and to address safeguarding issues and understand the victimhood within child sexual exploitation. It's not so easy always for the police and for safeguarding agencies, or even the victims themselves, to recognise their own victimhood when it comes to child criminal exploitation. In child criminal exploitation, there are a range of contextual challenges and issues which mean that the police struggle to always understand and know when the child that is in front of them, or even the adult that's in front of them that's wrapped up in county lines, is culpable of the criminal activity that they've become involved with, or whether they are victims of exploitation, and where that blurring takes place. And where the blurring takes place can determine whether they are put down an enforcement route or they are put down a safeguarding route. And we found that this kind of challenge continues to be at the very centre of how young people and some adults are processed when it comes to county lines. There are other issues which make this more difficult, issues like adultification. It's a concept which is well recognised even within the policing and by the police themselves, that, for example, a young, stroppy, rude, aggressive 14-year-old black male can sometimes be considered to be perhaps more adult and older than an equivalent aged young white male. And it may be the case that too often in that kind of context that the young black male finds themselves on an enforcement route and a criminal justice route rather than a vulnerability and safeguarding route. As I say, these are issues that are recognised within the police force themselves as contextual issues that are challenging for them. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Ross. Okay, so I'm going to take over now and talk through some of the main key findings from our research. So first of all, it's worth recognising that our research has seen some very positive developments in some areas regarding how the police address issues of child criminal exploitation. So if we look at it across the piece, what we're seeing from the research is there's certainly a growing recognition that child criminal exploitation is occurring and the criminal justice system is taking steps towards addressing some of those issues. And particularly what we're seeing is a lot of mentions of vulnerability, a lot of focus on vulnerability, and a high level of interest from the police and safeguarding partners to understand the complexities that take place within exploitation. We're seeing quite a lot of localized progress. We're in some areas, and so some of the areas where we conducted phase one and even phase two of the research, supported by the supplementary interviews as well. What we found is there's a lots of examples of really effective processes and really effective practices that are taking place at local level, particularly within some of the local safeguarding partnerships. And these safeguarding partnerships and these collaborations in some places are doing a good job in supporting victims of child criminal exploitation. So certainly we're seeing a wider recognition of child criminal exploitation. Processes in some areas are being developed, and in some areas, some of the victims are being supported through multi-agency collaboration. So across the piece, we are seeing some movements in this direction. However, this is not the case in all of the areas where we conducted the research, and there are quite some significant challenges relating to the tensions we see between safeguarding and the need to recognise victimhood and the need to throw support around young people, in particular who are involved in county lines. Some of the enforcement approaches and some of the enforcement cultures within policing are still very much at the fore. And we look at individual police officers and individual police forces. Again, some of them do adopt trauma-informed and child-centred practices in line with the national guidance. This may be the case of actually having specialist workers or specialist teams within police forces to identify and address these issues. However, there's a clear kind of dividing line in some areas where the police responses to exploitation in drug markets, some of them are safeguarding led and very clearly safeguarding led, where there are where there's an idea that a young person could be seen as a victim from a very early stage of an investigation. But we're also seeing enforcement-driven approaches still coming to the fore. So the idea that young people who are picked up with drugs automatically need to be sent down a criminal justice route as opposed to a safeguarding route. So we're still seeing those tensions both across police forces and actually within police forces. So for example, a simple example would be someone from a child-centred policing team would look at a particular issue related to county lines in a very different way to police teams and police forces which are more focused on enforcement. So in many areas, again, the main focus is still on arrest, disruption, and prosecution of young people who are involved in county lines. And more broadly, the main focus in some areas is the shutting down of county lines, as opposed to putting more and greater focus on safeguarding approaches. And what we found is that these divergent approaches are very, very localized, and they are typically led by one or two people in leadership positions who really drive home the agenda around vulnerability and the agenda around safeguarding. So leadership's incredibly important, but also we're seeing that resourcing is important. Particularly in some of the smaller police forces that don't necessarily have the same level of expertise, training, and multi-agency infrastructure to support a shift away from enforcement towards one which is more focused on safeguarding. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. And quite clearly, our research has found that the victim-offender duality or dichotomy presents quite significant practical and ethical challenges for the police forces, and that the inconsistent handling of young people involved in county lines, whether that be safeguarding or enforcement, has some quite significant repercussions in terms of the procedural fairness and the kind of the uniformity of approaches across the country for young people who are involved in county lines. So, kind of to summarise this point, what we're seeing is differences across the country and differences within police forces. So there's a huge amount of variety of approaches going on in this space at the moment, and certainly not a huge amount of uniformity. So a bit more information about the inconsistent practices on policing and safeguarding. So what's quite challenging from our perspective as researchers when we're trying to identify good practice is that the evidence base from the police forces is really low. We don't necessarily know what police forces don't necessarily know what a good outcome is in terms of safeguarding. The data around safeguarding and enforcement is fairly poor across the piece. So we're seeing that even when approaches are being put in place around which are putting forward safeguarding, these aren't fully evaluated, they're not fully understood. So what this creates kind of in relation to the experiences for young people involved in county lines and their experiences of criminal justice system is essentially a postcode lottery. So victims outcomes depend very much on geography as opposed to circumstances which they're in. And this is really undermining procedural justice approaches which are being pushed forward by the police. And a key concern that was raised from our findings and from many of the participants we spoke to was that the training available to police officers in relation to county lines is incredibly inconsistent. And this is from a police perspective and key professionals. I think in one of the areas we found that some of the people who are involved in MACE meetings didn't receive a high level of vulnerability training. So this very much undermines the processes which are trying to be put in place. And this essentially means that many victims are treated as perpetrators, or in some circumstances treated as vulnerable perpetrators. So one of the recommendations we're putting forward from our research is that across the UK we need to establish a minimum or baseline threshold on what a good investigation looks like in terms of county lines. This would talk about kind of safeguarding processes that needs to be put in place on a mandatory basis, and baseline standards in terms of policing, in terms of collecting data and various other things. And what the idea of this would be to ensure that every police force has some form of consistency in terms of their structures around CCE, their training processes, and kind of the processes which they follow when they're following an investigation, so we can get greater consistency and to promote the ideas of procedural justice across the UK. And kind of as I've already alluded to, the lack of unified evidence base is very problematic. So we don't necessarily know what's occurring in police forces. Police forces themselves, in many circumstances, don't necessarily understand what's going on in their particular area from a data perspective. So we can't necessarily say what is good practice, what is best practice, because a lot of these approaches haven't been fully evidenced or evaluated to an evidence threshold where we can say that this is good or bad practice. So that needs to be addressed. And there's really inconsistent reporting and recording practices, both within police forces and across police forces. An example of this would be that when some police forces are undertaking when they're undertaking practices or enforcement weeks, for example, to really crack down on county lines, they may say that a certain number of people have been safeguarded as a result of the work they've been conducting, but we don't necessarily actually know what safeguarding means in that context. That may well be a referral to social services, or maybe something which is far broader and far more holistic. So we don't know what's really going on, kind of underneath the surface, to understand what's going on for safeguarding processes. And a lot of data on victims, exploitation patterns, and a lot of the outcomes for the young people involved in county lines, that's missing, or at best is incomplete. So what we need really, well, the implications of this are that without a consistent and a robust evidence base, we don't necessarily know what's working, and we can't really put anything forward in terms of how things can be improved in the future for young people involved in county lines. And one of the interesting things we found when we were conducting our research and conducting our analysis is that the county lines term may not be useful anymore. It may well have actually served its purpose in the past, and maybe we need to move on to something which is kind of more focused upon exploitation. Primarily, the main reason why this is one of our findings is that a lot of child criminal exploitation now occurs on a local level. So if we go back to what Ross was talking about earlier, is that originally the county lines methodology or county lines terminology was developed to capture young people being exploited in one area, being sent to another part of the country to go and sell drugs for a particular gang. Whereas what we're finding is that a lot of exploitation and recruitment into county lines gangs is happening on a local level. Thus, the whole terms of county lines and the movement of people from one county to another isn't necessarily relevant anymore. And this is quite a significant problem. If we look at it from a public health perspective, public health perspectives essentially argue that you need to have so the issue which you're trying to address needs to be labelled in the correct way. Otherwise, the approaches to combat it are informed by the language. So, for instance, if we were to continue with the terminology of county lines, that is still a largely enforcement focused lens, whereas actually we need to move towards something which is more focused on exploitation and safeguarding. And there needs to be a kind of shift in policing resources, and to understand that exploitation is ubiquitous within almost all drug markets, and the cross-border transportation of young people from one area to another is kind of moribund. It's not essentially the most important thing. The most important thing is exploitation, not geography. So one of the recommendations that we have is to develop a terminology and a set of strategies that address all forms of exploitation, regardless of scale, geographic scope, or the model of drug distribution. And a lot of the policies and a lot of the structures which are in place to combat county lines presently don't necessarily reflect the picture of what we just spoke about in terms of localized exploitation. So a lot of the funding which is allocated to police forces to combat county lines typically goes to the larger police forces, so Metropolitan Police, West Midlands Police, Greater Manchester, Merseyside Police. They're the recipients of the largest amount of money in terms of county lines disruption activity and safeguarding activity. But what we know now is that smaller and more rural police forces are being impacted by county lines activities or county lines type exploitation. However, they generally lack funding, they lack the expertise, and they lack the support to be able to do anything about it to the same levels as their larger police peers. And the outdated strategies have always spoken about this, but essentially what we're arguing is that not enough attention has been paid to the evolving patterns of exploitation and the greater levels of exploitation and the greater levels of vulnerability that's being identified in our rural and smaller towns. And again, what this does is this creates yet another postcode lottery, whereby if you're picked up in one force which has quite robust processes and has quite a lot of resourcing around safeguarding, then you're going to get a certain experience. Whereas if you're being picked up in a smaller police force, which doesn't necessarily have the same resources to identify and respond to vulnerabilities, then you're going to get a very different experience of a criminal justice system. So the implications of this quite clearly are that the lack of funding for smaller police forces creates gaps in combating exploitation, and it doesn't address the localized nature of exploitation. So the national strategies to disrupt county lines and the national strategies around vulnerability and around safeguarding are very different for rural and urban contexts. So our recommendation in this regard is to focus on redistributing funding and resources to ensure that the smaller police forces in the UK have a capacity to address exploitation effectively. And similarly, many of the strategies on a national level need to be adjusted to focus on exploitation of young people as a primary concern, and to kind of push the transportation of drugs to the background. So essentially a wider focus on exploitation over other issues. And we're seeing quite significant gaps in policy and practice around trauma-informed approaches as well. So what we noticed from the interviews we conducted with police officers, particularly phase 1, where we interviewed senior police officers from 44 of the 45 forces, is that the trauma-informed language is being used extensively across the police, but its integration into practice is really inconsistent. So the terminology is being used, but is that terminology actually impacting practice? What we're finding is to a certain extent, it's probably not. And this goes back to training again. So many police officers haven't received the adequate training to recognise and respond to the trauma experienced by vulnerable young people who are involved in county lines. And a lot of the policies in relation to county lines are being developed without fully understanding the impacts on victims and the outcomes in practice. So national policies which are being put forward, they're not necessarily being kind of reflective of what's being put on the ground. And going back to the data points that I made earlier, is that because the data isn't being collected, because the data around county lines exploitation and safeguarding isn't particularly robust, we're finding that trauma-informed approaches are not being evaluated, and we don't truly understand what's working and what's not working. And again, inconsistent monitoring, lack of data, and police forces are collecting different data sets and different police forces across the UK, excuse me, are collecting different data sets. So our understanding of what works is incredibly limited. And I also want to reflect on the interviews that we conducted with the people with lived experience in county lines, and particularly some of the interviews we conducted with parents of young people who are involved in county lines. So some of the things they highlighted is there's been a lack of investment in public services. There's not enough prevention work to stop young people getting involved in county lines. And interestingly, the parents in particular spoke about how the police and how the safeguarding agencies aren't putting enough emphasis on creating exit strategies from county lines. And the broader points that was made in many of these interviews is that county lines is been driven by structural inequalities and has been driven by poverty. So when we look at the broader picture of our research in relation to the experience of people who are experiencing county lines, we see that policing alone cannot resolve this issue, and that in order to really get rid of county lines or to address county lines cohesively, we need to have deep structural reforms to address the drivers of this form of exploitation. However, the police can make a difference. And with that in view, these are our final policy recommendations. So what we need in the UK is a coordinated approach to county lines. There needs to be a national strategy that is coordinated by the Home Office or the most appropriate organisation. And this really needs to be strong, robust, it has to have teeth, and it has to really push forward on what needs to be done on a local level. There needs to be a production of minimum safeguarding thresholds to ensure that all practices are consistent across the many different police forces to get rid of the issues we've spoken about in relation to all the postcode lotteries. We need to have greater emphasis on trauma-informed training and to really embed evidence-based approaches like what we found in this research to shape approaches to everyday police in relation to child criminal exploitation. The funding of police forces and the funding of strategies to address these issues needs to be rethought, and in particular, the smaller and more rural police forces need to have greater levels of funding so that they can be more aware of exploitation and be able to put more emphasis and greater safeguarding processes in place for young people who are involved in county lines. We need more, and from those things, we need to have more evidence-based policy making and develop strategies based on empirical data and victim outcomes, as opposed to what police forces feel works in their particular area. And finally, all of this means that we need to have greater monitoring and more effective monitoring of these national standards to ensure that trauma-informed practices are implemented and that they're followed and properly evaluated. So, in addition to the presentation today, we have produced a 4-page short report that details everything we've spoken about today. And if you want to put your camera up to the screen, you'll be able to get access to that report there. So I'm going to leave that on the screen for another 5 seconds so you can access that. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Charlie.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris and Ross, for a very clear presentation. We've got some questions coming in, happily, and so let's go to those. The first question we got was, how did you manage to get such good cooperation from so many police forces? And Ross has indicated that he would like to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, it actually wasn't very easy to begin with. We had to work at this quite hard, and it took up some time during the beginnings of the project. But once we got over the initial hurdles, such as vetting from the National Police Force Vetting Agency, and worked out with them exactly what kind of risk we posed to police forces individually, and also worked out that the effective way of communicating with people was to tell them as much about ourselves, but also to inform them of the very senior police force and, say, NPCC representation that we have on the centre's governing board and advisory board, in other words, demonstrating good support for the project, enabled us to convince police forces that we had credibility and that we were supported by the higher echelons of the police force in the UK. But I think for me, most importantly, although we couldn't measure this, we think that on top of that, it was quite simply because the police themselves in all of the forces saw this as an issue and an area that they wanted answers to, wanted help with, and that the centre helped us to provide us with enough credibility such that those police forces trusted that what we were intending to do was help them rather than do some kind of a hatchet job on them. And one of the ways that we convinced them that that was going to be the case was to provide full anonymity and confidentiality to all of the police forces and to all of the people that spoke to us that was the condition that we provided them with, and therefore they felt it was fine to speak openly to us, and that they would not, neither themselves, individuals, nor any police forces would be recognised. And this was communicated very strongly to them at the beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we've got a number of questions on prevention, which is really interesting. So there's this sort of general question in terms of what prevention work might we adopt to avoid the exploitation of young people in the first place, and what does that mean for national strategy? But then also, is there an argument to invest in local youth services in terms of preventing young people becoming exploited in this way? Chris, do you want to have a go at that one, or Ross?
Yeah, I'll jump in with that one. So, in terms of prevention work, we know there's been good work conducted by organisations like the Iverson Trust. The Iverson Trust is an organisation that provides education and support to parents whose children have been involved in county lines. And I know they're doing some excellent work with some police forces and schools to raise concerns and to kind of educate people who are involved in county lines. So it's certainly getting people with lived experience involved in that process of talking about prevention work. But I think it's worth going back to previous points, is that county lines has been driven to a very large extent by structural inequalities and issues around poverty. So when we're talking about kind of concerns around prevention, we need to recognise there is very much a structural element to it, and that policies to address poverty needs to be front and centre for that.
Do you have anything to add, Ross?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a shift in this country towards something called public health criminology, but that's also reflected in something called public health policing. But I think we should probably say also public health prevention work in a range of ways. So you can go back as far as early years. We know that there are fairly strong, robust early years interventions that can make a real difference to the sorts of things that Chris was talking about, and those sorts of interventions are meaningful from pre-birth even in certain areas. But also in terms of prevention, it's about, I think that there are lots of areas that the police and safeguarding partnerships are involved in these days that recognise that multi-agency partnership working that's effective across the education sector, across the health sector, across various sectors, that if they're operating in a meaningful way, they're going to improve prevention activities across the piece. But many of these sectors don't necessarily at this moment have full training that they need. They don't have partnership structures in place that enable effective levels of prevention to be enabled. And importantly, of course, they're not necessarily resourced to do those things as effectively as they could be.
Great. Thank you very much. We've got this question here. Are you able to share good practice of young people that have been able to exit county lines safely and re-engage with EET, education, employment training, please? So can you think from the research of some examples of success? So moving from prevention to in terms of outcomes.
For
Chris,
me,
yeah, go on,
I'm
Ross.
going to jump in here, Charlie. Look, I mean, we spoke to quite a few people, including key people in local authorities that were doing some very good things, or they appeared to be very good things on the surface. They were certainly very passionate and very involved, engaged individuals. But when I asked people at local authority level for data, when I asked them for throughput data, to try to give me some insight into what works for them, they've got passion, they've got structures, they've got people attempting to have the backs of exploited and victimized young people. But when I tried to push for the evidence as to whether their system that they've put in place has the kind of outcomes that they would want it to, they really struggled to provide that. So some of the things that Chris was talking about in relation to effective outcomes in the police and what counts as a safeguarding outcome. I'm afraid is replicated in many, not all, of course, but in many local authority areas that would struggle to demonstrate their effectiveness in that regard.
Okay. Are we happy to, do you want to add briefly something, Chris, or shall I move on to the next?
No, Ross has covered that.
Okay, brilliant.
Move
Because we've got quite a lot of questions coming in, and I do apologize to question askers in that we won't cover them all, I'm afraid, but we've got a rather long and interesting double one here. So question one, the awarding of victim status is very subjective, as you mentioned. Do you see there is merit in developing an objective assessment to recognize a victim? Let's start with that one, and then we'll come on to the second one in a second. Ross.
Well, there is merit in trying to get somewhere close to what might be considered an objective measure. It's probably difficult to achieve that completely. And also, one of the problems with it is that you need a measure that is both understood by those that apply it. So, for example, the police currently do have numerous forms, tick box forms, for example, whereby these are meant to be aid memoirs to enable them to assess the degree or the extent to which an individual before them may or may not be a victim or may not be exploited. But in many cases, these forms aren't particularly effective or helpful. They vary across forces, and their take up varies incredibly, even within forces. And really, whatever form of measure that might be produced after some considerable work and consideration, it also needs to be understood that whatever is used needs to be done, needs to be used within a context whereby those people that are implementing it fully understand it and indeed use it. And then there need to be follow-on processes which take full advantage of whatever outcome it is that people, I mean, to play a devil's advocate, it might be an easier place to start, and there are the odd forces in the country that do this. It might be an easier place to start that if you arrest somebody, for example, county lines engagement, involvement, and they're under the age of 18, it might be easier to assume that there's some level of exploitation and victimization involved. I'm not saying that that would resolve the problems, but it might be an easier place to start than trying to sift people on the front line and work out whether they need to go through an enforcement or a safeguarding route.
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, yeah, certainly these kind of forms can be very useful, and Ross covered that. But I think one thing to emphasize as well is that if you are going to have that kind of form, it needs to be really embedded it into the whole process. So you need, if you're going to have a vulnerability assessment form or something like that, that needs to speak to that individual police officer's training. That needs to speak to the processes which are in place of a local authority. So there's a lot to consider within all of that. As a standalone document, it's not necessarily useful unless it's a part of a wider ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. There's quite an interesting, challenging, they're all interesting questions, but there's a particularly interesting, challenging question here, I think. So the Home Office fund the National Prevention Programme to improve the responses to exploitation. It's important to remember that preventing exploitation is about preventing a need that an exploiter will take advantage of. This is not always poverty. Any child can be exploited. Children cannot consent to their own exploitation. They cannot choose to decide not to be involved. And this notion is just victim blaming. You can put all the safeguarding actions in for a victim, but unless there is a parallel disruption of the perpetrators, and that means all perpetrators up the line, then it will not work alone.
Can you summarize that for us, Charles?
Oh my God. I think the overall point is that you you know the prevention and focusing on young people and their lives is all well and good and very important, but ultimately you also need to be tackling the perpetrators, the people that are pulling them into these criminal gangs. And in a sense, to focus only on prevention would be to miss that very important enforcement angle.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we for 1 second would be suggesting that. Enforcement has to be part and parcel of what's going on. But if you look at the current context, you might argue either through police culture or through resource allocations that are made at the higher level within any one police force. These things are going to determine the extent to which some police officers, for example, and in the safeguarding partnerships, are exposed to what degree of training to make them. I mean, we would argue very strongly that child criminal exploitation isn't necessarily a very easy concept for people to understand early on. And therefore, if you've got, but the term is well known. That, but because you know the term, it doesn't mean you fully understand what's going on within that space. And I've had police officers say to me, that child admitted that they'd done this, and therefore they were fully culpable of that particular crime, which speaks to me of a complete misunderstanding of the nature of victimization and child criminal exploitation. Um, what was worrying about that one particular police officer was that they were in a position of authority in relation to dealing with child criminal exploitation. If you ramp that up across a police force where very in some police forces there's large amounts of police officers that are trained in both CSE and in CCE, but in most police officers it's actually a minority. And what we found most worryingly was that many of the people, including people that were chairing mace hubs, were not necessarily themselves trained in CCE. So if you have a context whereby people are not fully trained and not fully aware of the problem, then the level of enforcement versus safeguarding that's going to take place arguably is perhaps weighted too strongly in level of enforcement. So our position isn't that enforcement is unimportant, not at all, but that probably the weight at this moment in time continues to be towards enforcement rather than safeguarding.
Right. We're kind of running out of time, and there are a couple of questions asking about next steps. So, are you able to say anything about sort of what happens next in this space?
Well,
Ross,
I think
that's
that
one of you.
I think that we're engaging with partners, both through the centre and as the research becomes more disseminated, we want to engage with people that would be interested in partnering us in perhaps pilot projects to work on a whole range of areas that the project raised, from training through to looking at individual projects around something like cuckooing, for example, and the extent to or the extent to which data might be unified across spaces as well. So at the moment, there's a whole range of potential areas that we will progress onto, and we would invite people to get in touch with us if they think they've got an idea in that regards as well.
Which is ideal because we should finish probably with some contact information. First of all, I want to say thank you everybody for your engagement, for all your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I hope you found it a useful webinar. And thank you to the presenters, to Nathan for setting it up so well, but also to obviously to Chris and Ross for a very fluent presentation and interesting responses to our questions. Are we able to get the slides up? Because I think we've got a final slide which gives you a bit of info on how to access the website and the report. Maybe I'm wrong in that. Chris, you're able to get the...
There are a couple of links to websites, social media channels, etc. There was a question I answered in the Q&A to share the website URL, which will also link to our different social channels as well from there.
Yeah, I mean, actually, practically, it's really easy because you just put into Google vulnerability in policing, you're going to find us. And that website has a whole range of information. It will also have the recorded session. We'll be putting that up, won't we, Nathan? So So if you want to go back to this discussion, the presentation, you'll be able to access it there. There we go. Stay connected with the centre. There's our website and our various social media links. So I should bring it to a close, it being 2 o'clock. Thank you very much for attending. I wish it was more interactive. These things never can be ultimately interactive, but thank you for joining us, and I hope you found it a useful session.